Where we're at right now is everything is equal. For the most part, everyone's going to pay the same to offer content. Everyone's going to pay the same to use that content. There's different plans for network access available, depending on your area. But other than that, everything is about the same right now. And I think if we let it get to the point where everything has an oversight, then there's a lot of opportunity for people to limit not only what we can see, but how we see it and how much we pay to see those individual things.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you're for leaving network neutrality in place as it is?
No, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't see any reason to have any type of oversight on what we do, how we do it, and how much of it we do on the internet.
Okay. Well, but to kind of counteract that point, what I'm hearing you say is you don't want oversight, but then we have government oversight on the network net neutrality by having that law in place. Is that it almost seems like it's kind of a two-sided piece. So we have oversight, but it would prevent oversight.
Yeah, I mean the net neutrality is more of a standard right now.
Okay.
It's not being enforced by anyone. It's not being policed by anyone, and I'm not sure how it affects other countries, but from what I've read, it's we're mostly talking about the FCC, which is a United States entity, and the internet is all over the world. The World Wide Web covers the world. So how can you have that type of regulation in one country and not in others? So now you're talking about a worldwide problem that the U.S. really shouldn't be involved in.
Right.
And so there's a lot of lines that need to be crossed. And I'm not sure that a lot of the people in our current government have the ability to talk to the other countries in a way that makes them understand what we're trying to do in our country.
Well, I also think that a lot of people in our government don't understand what most of the internet is or does.
That's what I mean.
So, not to put too much of a political opinion out there, but I feel like that's both sides of the aisle. I think most people think the internet is just a series of tubes. I've been wanting to get that out there. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate that. Matthew, give us your short opinion on what you think net neutrality.
What it boils down to is that if you remove the net neutrality where everything's equal and all that kind of stuff, you can open it up to censorship just because this internet provider doesn't like what that one person is saying type of a thing.
Or company.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to affect the big businesses' bottom line, and it's going to affect the personal opinions of people.
One of the arguments for net neutrality comes along that they can just say this content isn't viewable on this ISP simply because they disagree with that person's point of view, that company's political stance, etc. In all fairness, internet neutrality is actually a fairly new concept. The internet had no legislation or anything to govern it for many years when after it was first released and such, built, whatever you want to call it. And I know a lot of people are like, well, when that was the case, there was no problems and such. Well, there's a reason net neutrality was introduced, is because it became such a large part of people's lives. There's so much information on the internet that is more or less essential at this point to most people, especially in the United States, that giving the ability to limit it based on what internet provider you can afford or what package, like a cable TV package, they could say, well, you get these websites, but not these websites unless you pay for this package. And that limits a lot of information,
Sure.
which can cause serious problems.
No, I completely agree. It's definitely not something this is definitely not an easy subject. I actually had lunch with a couple of friends or colleagues that work for a master agent, and what a master agent does is they provide or they help us provide internet for our clients. But he had a really interesting analogy, which is almost pro removing net neutrality. Mm-hmm. And his example was, so building a car that all your friends are allowed to drive at any given time, but you may not be allowed, you basically can't control it. And that's to some extent how the internet has been built. Mm-hmm. So some of these large nationwide carriers have these massive backbones, and they built it to provide traffic to their customers, but as a result, they're just basically required to do the exact same thing for everyone, and they're not allowed to do what they want to do with their infrastructure, if you will.
Right.
But I definitely see this potentially impacting our clients, especially as more and more people go to the cloud, because now, let's say you're with Charter, and if you want to be able to get to Microsoft Azure, you have to buy their express route.
Right.
And so now you're buying an extra service in order to get there fast enough.
Right.
How do you see this impacting our clients over the next year or so if this went through?
Well, there's no crystal ball. There's no way to tell
Right.
if something like that's going to be repealed,
Mm-hmm.
when it's going to be repealed, and what the rules are going to be, on paper
Sure.
once all that happens. So it's hard to say how it affects the average corporate client.
Mm-hmm.
I would think that a lot of our small business clients are going to be in a position where most of them aren't media consumers.
Sure.
Most of them are using business services. I would imagine that on that level, a lot of our business customers are going to be offered similar business packages to what they have now.
Sure.
Allow them to email, allow them to get to, the things that they need.
Right.
Will it reduce or increase the pricing for that? I would imagine it would increase the pricing because there's more legwork that needs to be done to make sure that the infrastructure is tailored to that environment, things
Sure.
like that. So I like to think about the small guys.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think about the people that are down on their luck,
Mm-hmm.
that need to find a job,
Right.
that can walk into a library and post their resume and apply for jobs on Craigslist and apply for jobs on LinkedIn and apply for jobs on Facebook and can
Sure.
get out there in a very broad way. Once that oversight starts happening, a lot of those options may not be available.
Or they might be available, but just painfully slow.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think about the parents that need a babysitter.
Mm-hmm.
And they can go out and there's different options for them to find those resources.
Sure.
And by limiting things, by establishing traffic lanes, you're taking that beauty of the internet away, of having a large ocean to fish from.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Matt, do you have any?
I more or less like what Sam said is that it has the potential to remove that freedom of,
Sure.
as I was saying earlier, information and such. Some people will argue that no company is going to shoot themselves in the foot by limiting it and such, but companies do it all the time.
Sure.
And not only companies, but consumers, and they say, oh, we're not going to go with this company because XYZ. Well, unfortunately, there's so many people out there consuming so much.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these companies, it doesn't really affect them. And it's while doing this one thing may, force a bunch of people away from them, at the same time, it may make a bunch of people flock to them.
Well, not to mention the government.
Right.
The larger corporations have as many people to please, not as many, but have people to please in the government, just like they have to please their stockholders and their consumers.
Right.
So keeping those people happy is going to be very important. The bigger the company gets, the more they're going to want to keep those type of people happy. which is going to lean their policies and procedures towards that, the legislature, whatever they pass to control content.
Right. So it's hard to say what legislation would go in place to, it's possible that, like right now, net neutrality is all traffic is equal.
Sure.
It's possible that if current net neutrality is removed, they could put in legislation that says, okay, you can charge creators of content more based on how much bandwidth and such they use, but you can't block the internet.
Sure.
You can't stop access to those creators. You can only charge them more because people access their stuff more.
Part of where I see the real flaws of removing net neutrality is that there's just not general availability. Not everyone in the U.S. has access to multiple providers. Not everyone in the U.S. has access to the same level of speed. You know, they talk about high-speed internet, and a lot of places are still on dial-up, or all they can get is like satellite. Definitely. And so I think that's really where we're running into some issues where you have such a huge monopoly. You start having, Charter and Spectrum or Spectrum, Comcast, Verizon, all that sort of thing, where they have such a massive control over your ability to get internet that removing that neutrality would really, you can't vote with your dollar by going anywhere else. And I think that's probably my single biggest concern about them repealing net neutrality is just that I can't go to somebody else. I don't have, 5 ISPs, on net at my building to just go to the one that's actually going to give me the best service.
Well, you don't right now either.
Well, it's true. It's true. But that's really why I feel so strongly for net neutrality is because we can't just go to, a third or fourth provider.
Oh, yes.
So we're really tied to being on Frontier Fios or...
So now not only are we tied to the provider, but we're tied to whatever oversight
decided to provide.
Right.
And I think that's my personal biggest concern about it is, we're wanting to get government out of internet, which I typically would agree with. I feel like less government oversight is good, but I also feel like we've had so much government oversight and allowing the monopoly to happen that we really only have 1 or 2 carriers just about anywhere. And as a result, we as the consumer are stuck unless we want to try to build out something that's extraordinarily expensive.
It's cable TV all over again. You used to be able to put rabbit ears on a TV and pick up all the channels you could pick up, and consume whatever you wanted. And then all of a sudden, there's cable TV and they give you, I don't know, however many channels, 60 channels. And it seemed like for a while, the more channels they added, the more you got. Then eventually, you started seeing that same price for the base channels, 35 channels.
Right.
And then you see an additional price for the HD channels. Right. And then you see an additional price for the movie channel.
And now you want HBO.
So that's what that reminds me of is one day I'm gonna get internet to my house and I'm gonna have to pay, for, I don't know, Google access. Mm-hmm. And then I'm gonna have to add on Netflix access. Right. And then I'm going to have to add on, and you're being nickeled and dimed over and over again. Your bill is going up. The possibility of additional fees, additional taxes, activation fees, and all that BS is being added onto it, and I just don't want to be there. Thankfully, there's a lot of countries in the world that you can move to that won't have those regulations.
It's true.
And not just physically, but and it's kind of a little bit off the subject, but virtually too. I always think about, okay, I'll proxy in or VPN into somewhere else. There's a lot of other countries that can give me that I can log into that will give me no regulation already right now that aren't tracking my internet.
Right. The issue with that is simply then they could pass legislation saying you're not allowed to do that.
Well, there's a will, there's a way. While there's satellites in the sky.
Well, it's
okay. We'll bring out
along the lines of. That doesn't mean it's not illegal. Just because you can find a way to do it doesn't mean you won't get in trouble.
Today in the news, Sam's going to jail because he... sorry.
I still know of these devices that you can hook up to a phone line and attach to a computer.
Oh, yeah.
And...
What is it called? Is it a dial-up modem?
Modem.
Okay, modem. Yeah, shoot.
So, I mean, I've been there before. I'll go back there again if I have to.
Right. I'm just... If they start, putting in legislation that, okay, these people can now limit what you see, and you want to try and get around it using their service, well, then they can, say it's okay for them to block that particular type of traffic. Well, then, I mean, yeah, you can go to dial-up, but it's...
Who wants to go to dial-up?
Then you put an antenna on your house so you don't have to pay for cable.
Essentially, it's just
Back to our 13 channels.
an example of a snowball type
They're free.
thing of where it could go and problems that...
Snowballing
Erupt.
is definitely a big concern.
Right.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Please, sure.
Do it.
Okay, so I'm
You
pro.
invited us.
I'm pro.
You want to jump into the conversation?
No, I'm pro net neutrality, right? But just because I don't think that there's enough information, right? Like I think we need to not jam in stuff over Thanksgiving and give people more information, right? Like, so most every up here is pro or neutral, right? I think the discussion that we should be having is what makes people want to repeal it. Because there is some validity to, I don't like my ISP. There's not enough of them. And because they laid all of their lines using government subsidized funds,
You have strong words, buddy.
their position is we're so far ahead, bring on the competition. Nobody, because we've already cut deals with the counties, we already have this
You've
here,
laid the
we're already
fiber.
locked up, we have a 10-year contract with this state and a 15-year contract with this county.
It's probably
and
more
if
like
somebody
30,
comes
but
along, nobody's going to make a dent. So how do we change it so that we are bringing the competition? That because they want to repeal it to bring in competition. I don't believe the way that it's set up right now will necessarily repeal competition. But to BJ's point, I don't want the government in anything of mine. I want them to stay away from me, my internet. I don't want my freedom of speech limited. I don't want anything limited. So you're all very well versed in it. How would you change the law to make it something that you supported repealing?
Okay.
wow, that was a big question. Basically, what would we change?
No, small question, long statement before the question.
That's a big
How
question.
would you- how would
You're
you-
basically asking about
How would you structure the repeal so that you supported it?
how would I structure the repeal so that I would support it? I would say, personally, I feel the only way that I would get on the repeal net neutrality bandwagon wholeheartedly is if as a country we removed the regulation on the polls, permitting, or dramatically eased the process for new ISPs to come in to play.
To an area.
Right now what's happening is cable companies come in, they get a lockdown on an area for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. They get the cable license for the city. No other company can come in and take the poll rights. They can't get the permits for adding other cable companies. There's no competition. They're literally the only person in the area for the next 30 or 40 years.
Right.
That's huge.
Right. I've tried to think along those lines of like, what would it take to make me like repealing net neutrality? And I can't get myself there because I know that the issues that you're talking about poles and about laying fiber and about those things are local issues.
They are.
You're talking about a city making a decision to not allow Google into their city, a county making a decision to not allow X company, whatever, a state making those decisions. But what we're talking about with net neutrality is a federal issue.
Oh, the reality is it's
That
more of
would
a
need-
global issue than even a
Well,
federal
just
issue.
the way it is right now,
Sure.
it would need to trickle down to those states. And but I like with where you're going with that is because in order for me to support those kind of regulations, I would want more options than I currently have, which is one provider. So if I had an option to choose between the base package or the all-you-can-eat package, which is a similar price from this other provider, it wouldn't really matter to me because I know I have
The ability to go somewhere
something
else.
somewhere else to go.
Right. Well, I feel like kind of going on to what you were saying is I feel like at a federal level you would have to start re-regulating the local issues, which kind of scares me because I don't think the government gets many things right.
Well, it's not
Pardon
just
my opinion,
It's
but-
not just that. It's just, there's local governments.
Right.
There's local governments that have to make decisions. They're not informed enough to make those decisions.
Right.
Then up the chain you go.
It's true. And a lot of the laws a lot of the stuff that drives these laws are things that are from 100 years ago, back when everything was purely copper.
Right.
And so we're dealing with a lot of
and telephone laws.
exactly. We're dealing with a lot of regulations for old school telephone switching, where literally you had a person sitting behind a board plugging crap into the wall,
Right.
and we're trying to manage multi-gigabit, multi-terabit fiber connections, which are completely different.
For me to get behind repealing, there would need to be some sort of new legislation saying that you can't just block something randomly. There has to be some sort of process to go through to make sure that it's not being blocked because of anything except it's more expensive, so we have to charge them more. They're using more of our system. It's a drain on our resources, so we have to charge them more. So the cost has to be passed on. We can't just say we don't like that company anymore, so gone.
So you're okay with price hikes, just not
But it even seems like if
blocking.
you're going to start doing price hikes,
because
well, and the part that gets even more interesting is most of this bandwidth consumption is happening in the last mile. It's not happening cross country.
Right.
And so that last mile stuff isn't nearly as expensive as the cross country. So, I mean, we start having, Netflix has got content delivery networks, CDNs all across the country.
Oh, yeah.
So all that content is only going from the Frontier building here in town out 5 miles.
So we have an advantage living in California.
Well,
Silicon
absolutely.
Valley's right there.
Well, and
We're close to LA. We're close to the most
Close to
connected.
LA, yeah.
Well, and the fact of the matter is that they are paying more because of those content distribution nodes.
For sure.
All these, big providers. There's not just one location in Antarctica or something like that
That's
is
streaming internet up to
streaming
everyone.
all of this content.
Yeah.
There are buildings all through the United States, that are hosting duplicates of all this data, so that you're not dealing with an outage in Pittsburgh causing
Down for everyone else.
down for everybody
You
else.
guys don't have a backbone from LA to your house?
I do actually. It's called FiOS, or it's pretty close to a backbone. I mean, I get like 2 milliseconds to LA. That's not too
the
bad.
same.
But-
Oh, sorry. Drop off the nerd.
One millisecond.
Damn it, I hate when people are faster than me.
I'm an
Right, so-
elitist.
The argument that these people need to pay more is, in my opinion, somewhat weak because they are paying more.
That's true.
They-
They've already paid more.
They are paying a lot of they're paying for a lot of bandwidth at all of these facilities.
And data
And
centers.
exactly.
Well, and
Data
so
centers are not cheap.
I really feel like that they are probably paying more for bandwidth than anyone in the country realizes. And so there's this huge argument back and forth about they need to pay more. Well, like you said, that's a really great point. They are already paying a huge amount of money to a lot of different ISPs. And so now we get to have some fun. Those peering relationships are really what allow the ISPs to cut down on their bandwidth consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And so, having the CDNs, having the peering relationships, that's really, people are already paying a lot of money for these things.
Well, that may be what takes us back to what would make you support net neutrality. If there was some type of ceiling or some type of barrier where they recognize that these companies have already invested X number of billion of dollars into their infrastructure, so they are not applicable to all these extra regulations. But meanwhile, these these mid-sized companies, we need to really focus on, whatever the terminology they come up with is.
Leveling the playing field.
But
for
then
them.
when you get down to the smaller content providers, I think they need to be protected because I think Mark Zuckerberg needs the ability to start up the next Facebook. And I think those dorm rooms need the ability to continue innovating.
If I have just
Sure.
one server plugged in one location, I shouldn't have to be fighting for bandwidth because
Right.
I just
But
have
there's
one
no fight.
location.
But we're already fighting for bandwidth. A lot of it's amazing here in Southern California how many people don't have good internet, and we're in a major metro area. So
That's
we're
an
already
entirely
Oh
different.
no, it's true. But we're still fighting for. I get what you're
Fighting
saying.
for
Sorry, but
That's fighting to have access.
well,
not,
that's I guess another conversation
making sure
for another day.
that people can get to my server to get my content, type of a thing, and then I'm paying for, say, I have FiOS, so I've got a 50-50 connection, so I have 50 megs of upload.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I get.
Sure.
If I want more, I can pay more.
Sure.
That's just reality. I mean, that's how things are. So as long as that 50 megs doesn't somehow get, squished because there's a larger demand for Netflix at this time of day. So, now I've been restricted. As long as that is protected, then, that's something that would have to be in place.
Now, I think it's funny because I feel like to some extent this is already, some of that restriction has already happened because who hasn't, at the end of the day, had trouble streaming Netflix?
Oh, well, yeah.
Well,
What you're talking
Let's be
about-
perfectly honest.
What you're talking about is already happening. The funnel is already there.
Right.
They're guarantee. There's no guarantees in your bandwidth.
oh, absolutely.
They're providing you up to 50 megabits.
Oh, yeah.
And meanwhile, you're going back to a switch, and
50-ish.
depending on how many people are using that switch, and
Right.
depending on what the upstream is from that switch,
Right. But
makes
to me, that
your
is
internet
that's a
act at the speed it's going.
technical and, physical limitation, not something that they just decided and click.
Well,
now
it's
it's
true.
been shifted.
It's true.
If the physical technology just can't keep up with the demand, that's one thing. And,
In that case, increase your technology. I'm just saying.
well, exactly.
Right.
But, if it's a physical limitation that is limiting my bandwidth, that's one thing. If it's the company deciding that they're going to
We came out with our own
shift it
streaming
type
platform
of a thing.
instead of Netflix. I think that's really the thing that gets me is like the company shouldn't be. One of the other things that would allow me to really get potentially behind it is if, let's say, Frontier came out with their own competitor to Netflix, and they gave absolute priority to that, and would not allow Netflix to work. To me, that I see that happening, and that's probably my biggest concern about them repealing net neutrality. So you have providers just building their own, all the different services, only giving that priority, and then everything else just sits in the slow lane, not able to function.
Well, there was a time before Netflix.
When was that?
We're bringing back.
I think it was.
I'm okay with net neutrality if we bring back Blockbuster.
All right.
I am bored as hell on Friday
so
night.
basically
I'm
what
not
I-
having a
basically-
video store to go to.
That's what Redbox is for.
You can have
Go
your
rent a
fancy
movie.
Netflix.
You and your high speed
Netflix service.
sneaker net.
I'll get my DVDs in the mail. Thank you very much.
You get your 6 gigabytes delivered by mail. It might be faster.